Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at the Book of the Month Choice Awards, also known as the Books You See Before You Pay at Target Awards. Fantasy is my bread and butter, so that's primarily what we're going to be looking at today, but we are going to bounce around between a number of different genres, as one thing that I have found interesting about fantasy as a whole this year is when I was making my Goodreads predictions, I actually struggled to figure out where I thought certain books would even land. I didn't know if they would land in fantasy romance. Some of the ones that I thought would land in fantasy romance, I predicted they would land there, but I also felt like they should have been in fantasy. And then there were certain books that, because they were genre benders, which is a good thing, I think, they were hard to pin down because I didn't know if they would go in some kind of horror thriller story, if they would just be in general fiction. So we have a number of different categories to examine today, even though the focus is primarily going to be fantasy. I did make a predictions video and I have my notes of everything that I predicted. I also predicted some snubs, so we'll look at that as well. But as I go through the list of nominees, I am going to highlight the ones that I got correct, and then I'm going to highlight the ones that I was incorrect about. I'm not going to stress about the genres that the books were placed in as an incorrect or correct. I'm simply thinking about whether or not they were there. And this is due to the fact that I'm not trying to like hype my predictions up or anything like that, but rather the nominees have some tweaks made from one year to the next. I didn't know if they were going to combine genres or make new categories for various genres. So regardless, this is, I don't know, maybe the game portion of this is going to be boring, but I don't know if me just looking at them is that interesting. But all that to say, let's dive into it. Starting with the fantasy category, first up we have Map of the Otherlands. I did predict that this would be there. I was rather certain, one, because the first book was on the nominees last year, and two, because it's very popular. If I'm not mistaken, I think a lot of what ends up on the list of nominations is dependent on how many people put books on their want to read shelf, something like that. I don't really use Goodreads, so I never know what anything is called, but I think that's part of what goes into the determination of nominees. And I find that the users that are on Goodreads more often than not are also ones that might be more so leaning towards certain subgenres of fantasy that I think that Map of the Otherlands falls into. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and mark that that was correct, but I don't think many of us are surprised. Then we have A Song to Drown Rivers. I actually think I did predict, but then I think I edited out my prediction on accident, but I do have it in my notes. I have a little thing down here that says A Song to Drown Rivers, and then there's question marks, because I didn't know what genre that was going to go into, but I was correct that it's there. Part of why I didn't know what genre it was going to go into, I actually have read this since, I've read this, and I've actually already filmed a review for it within a New Fantasy Releases wrap-up. I just haven't had a chance to edit it yet, but when I read it, and even beforehand, I had a feeling this was going to be one of those, I didn't know if it was going to go in fantasy or if it was going to go in romantasy, is the way that they're wording the fantasy romance category. I didn't know which one it was going to go in. And then on top of that, I also didn't know if it was actually going to be more so historical fiction leaning. Having since read it, I think it's very historical fiction leaning with just a hint of speculative. So I think I would have felt more comfortable with this being categorized as just fiction and allowed for maybe some other more fantasy leaning fantasy books. Not trying to gatekeep fantasy, but the fantasy category every now and then has books in it that don't feel like they have a whole lot of fantasy elements to them. And so I think this would have fit very comfortably in historical fiction or just fiction. But I'm not surprised that it's here. I had a feeling it was going to be here. I also had a feeling because this author, I think they even have another book in the young adult category that's not young adult fantasy, just a contemporary story. I think they have a fairly loyal following, I guess you could say, and I had a feeling that following was going to follow them into their first adult work. So maybe that's part of it, but it's not been out for very long. It's a little bit surprising that it made the list, but we all know that this isn't based off of the amount of people who have read the book. It's just the amount of hype surrounding it. Next up, we have A Sorceress Comes to Call. I didn't know if there was going to be some kind of horror category, but I did predict that this was going to be here. Looking at the list currently, I'm trying to determine, because It's funny, I looked at this list last night, and then I immediately forgot everything that was on the list. And I looked at it several times. I kept going back to the fantasy category, because I would look at fantasy, and then I'd look at another category, and then I'd look at fantasy in another category. I just kept forgetting. And I don't know if that's because I was tired when I was looking at it, or if it's because nothing really stands out to me this year. Anyway, so A Sorceress Comes to Call, I think currently looking at this collection of books would be my vote. There's a few things obviously I haven't read, but I've read a decent amount of these. Anyway, A Sorceress Comes to Call I had on the list. I didn't have Empire of the Damned. I should have had Empire of the Damned. I've just not read Empire of the Vampire, so it kind of just, it wasn't even in my mind to think of this. I guess I can make a little tally at the bottom of ones that I didn't even consider. I'll only do this for the fantasy category. I won't do this for the other genres. But yeah, this one I didn't even consider, but it makes sense that this is here. I'm not surprised. It's quite popular. Five Broken Blades, aka the book that tricked people into thinking it was fantasy, and then everybody was shocked to find out it was fantasy romance. And then they doubled down. They're like, no, we're going to put it in fantasy. I haven't read it, so I am speaking more so through rumor. I have no idea if it's actually incredibly leaning into romantasy, but I'm going to trust my fellow reviewers and readers and say that it sounds like it is more fantasy romance leaning from everything I've heard about it. I have tried to avoid, you all know, I try to avoid hearing too much about books that I haven't yet read, because it's really important to me that I ensure I'm not accidentally sort of absorbing other people's thoughts and then delivering that to you as if they're my own. I don't want to do that, but I don't know the plot. I've just heard, because people have told me when I got it, people were like, no, actually that's fantasy romance. Or when my friends have talked about wanting to read it, people are like, by the way, just so you know, that's fantasy romance. And so I wasn't sure if it was going to pop up in fantasy or fantasy romance. Did I put it? I did think it was going to be in the fantasy romance category, but evidently not. But regardless, it is present. The Bright Sword. I knew this was going to be here because it's Lev Grossman. So that's not anything too shocking. Voyage of the Damned. This one I'm a little surprised by. I think because when I did anticipated releases videos throughout the year, this was on one of my anticipated releases videos, but I think that the release date maybe changed at some point and it was moving around, or there was different release dates depending on if it was US or UK. I just feel like there was something about the release that made it a little unclear as to when it was actually coming out, and if it was coming out at different times in the US versus UK. That's not really that important. But as a result of me not having a definitive idea of the release date, I think I kind of forgot about this one. And I'm wondering if this is more popular maybe on Book Talk, because I don't really know all that much about it. But that's probably my own fault for the whole thing I mentioned earlier about trying to avoid hearing too much about stuff. So this is one that I just didn't predict. I'll make a little tally at the bottom. Okay, The Tainted Cup. I was correct in that prediction. I don't think this one will win, but I can see a lot of the fantasy booktube readers voting for The Tainted Cup. I think it might make it into the next... Well, do I think it'll make it into the next round? Because it's not a Book of the Month pick. And a lot of times it's the Book of the Month picks that end up winning, or the books that can be categorized as fiction or might even be sold in fiction sections at bookstores. Those tend to rank high. Now that... Well, we've only had Romantasy for a short while as its own separate category. In the past, it was like, does Sarah J. Maas have a book release this year? Okay, well, that's the winner. But then after that, it was not always the easiest to determine. But I do find it's the ones that have more accessibility and further reach, I would say. Those tend to rank pretty high, so I don't know. I feel like The Bright Sword's going to rank high and make it to the next round because it's Lev Grossman. Maybe Five Broken Blades because it's popular. Map of the Otherlands will, I think, make it. I would like Sorceress Comes to Call to make it. That would make me quite happy. I think T. Kingfisher deserves more hype. But anyway, moving past The Tainted Cup, The Blackbird Oracle, All Souls Book 5. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I was never going to predict that because I have not read that series and I didn't know there was another installment coming out. The Book of Doors, haven't read it. I always feel like there's some book that has a cover like this. Every year there's something, or font that looks like this, because what is the book I'm thinking of? The Oh no, I can picture there's like a silhouette of I think of like a woman and a child, and I think the cover is black, and I've heard it's good. I don't know much about it, but there's always some kind of more, I think, literary style of fantasy nominee. So I'm glad for people that like those subgenres. I don't even know what it's about though, so I'm just basing this off of the look of the cover. Anyway, The Dead Cattail Assassins. I didn't predict this one, but that's cool that that one's on there. I haven't read it yet. I plan to at some point. I know it's, I think, novella length, so I could knock that one out pretty quick. Not that that's the only reason you read. You don't read just to get through stuff quickly, but you know what I'm saying. It's short. So The Lost Story, I predicted that would be there because it's a book of the month pick. So we'll go ahead and cross it off. And because of the whole thing I just described about how I think it has a lot of accessibility. My thing was that I didn't know if it was going to be fiction or fantasy because of the fact that sometimes when books get nominated in previous years under fiction, even if that author writes a book that is fantasy or within a different genre, sometimes it still gets considered fiction. So I thought The Lost Story that might happen to it. It did not. I feel like that was a very confusing side quest we just went on. Anyway, The Night Ends with Fire. I did not have that on my radar, so we are now up to 5 that I didn't predict. The Familiar, I knew that was going to be on there. Oh, this one's, I'm almost positive this one's going to get ranked high purely because it's Leigh Bardugo. I think it's just her name, because I don't know if a ton of people have loved this one. I know I thought this was going to be on there, but I don't have it written down. Oh, I do have it written down. Never mind, there it is. And then after that, we have the Somewhere Beyond the Sea. I should have known this was going to be on there, but like some of the other things, this is just not a series I'm that invested in, so it wasn't even in my mind to think about it, but yeah, that makes perfect sense. Oh, I skipped An Academy for Liars. Okay, this one I feel like is on the list because I think it's dark academia, and that's really popular in book talk circles a lot of times, but I am interested in that one. I remember it saying something about in the magic system you can manipulate matter or something like that, and I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. I like that idea, so I would be interested in picking that one up sometime. The Warm Hands of Ghosts. I predicted this would be on there because of the author. I didn't know if it would be in the historical fiction category or fantasy, but there it is in fantasy. A Sweet Sting of Salt. I don't know this one. I did not predict it. So there's the next tally. Then we have When Among Crows. I should have known this was going to be on there because once again, it's a well-known author, but I didn't. And then The Foxwife. Did I predict The Foxwife as just I thought that would be on there because it's a book of the month pick. I didn't. So there's another one I missed. But yeah, I didn't do as well as I thought I would with my predictions. I missed 10 within the fantasy category, but I did get, let's count them up because it's really exciting to hear people count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, the snubs. This is where I can win some points back. Even though, is it easier to predict snubs than it is to have the actual nominees? I don't know. My snub predictions, though, I had Trials of Empire, I was correct, that was snubbed. Foul Days, I was correct, that was snubbed. Sunbringer, yes, and The Fireborn Blade, yep. Now, I'm going to lose points by having some of my predictions that didn't end up here. We have I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons. I thought that would be on there, but alas, it is not. Fury of the Gods. I had a feeling it would be snubbed, but I think I was just holding out hope. Sadly, Shadow of the Gods is the only one from the series that was ever nominated. I thought Hera would be on this list because previous books by this author have been on the list in previous years, but I was wrong. I'll double check if Can't Spell Treason Without T is in maybe fantasy romance, but I have a feeling I'm wrong about that one. Let's look at fantasy romance, shall we? I had a feeling that The Spell Shop was going to be categorized as fantasy romance, even though I personally would have just put it in fantasy. I will be very curious when I do pick up Five Broken Blades to see if I think Five Broken Blades feels more like Romantasy, even though it was placed in fantasy, and if The Spell Shop, which I have read, if I think it feels more like fantasy than fantasy romance / romantasy. So that'll be fun when I eventually pick that up. That would be kind of an interesting, maybe it wouldn't be. I was going to say that would be an interesting video to do like a compare and contrast. But now that I think about it, I'm like, that the answer would be yes, this one does feel more like Romantasy, or no, this one doesn't. That would be the conclusion, so that's not interesting. For the Romantasy category, this is where I am no longer going to dock points for myself if I missed some of these, because this is not my bread and butter. I'm just going to give myself points for the ones that I predicted, which is maybe a little bit cheating. But anyway, When the Moon Hatched, I did predict, if it wasn't for the fact that there is a Sarah J. Maas release, I think this one might win, maybe. I'm not as in the know in fantasy romance circles, so that could be incorrect, but that one's been doing very well, and I did not care for it. After that, The Spell Shop. Yep, there it is. I really thought that that one should have been considered fantasy. Then The Honey Witch, this one really took me by surprise. I did not think The Honey Witch was going to be on this list. What is the average rating for this one? 3.62. Okay. I really think that this one might be a matter of it had a lot of people that wanted to read it and shelved it. And I know that the nominees aren't based off of average rating, but I still kind of feel like it's not maybe going to get the most amount of votes because of the fact that, yes, a lot of people were interested in reading it. It already has over 12,000 ratings, so a lot of people have read it. But a lot of people have been kind of middle of the road on it, so I don't think that one's going to rank particularly high. Then we have the Sarah J. Maas book. That's there, yeah. I'm scrolling through these kind of quick. I will have maybe them on the screen so that you can see if you're interested. But A Fate Inked in Blood, I did predict that would be on there. I wasn't sure, based off the cutoff dates, if Iron Flame would be on there. That would have won if it was. But yeah, Iron Flame was not there, so that one I'm just going to cross out. I had kind of thought maybe The God and the Gumiho might be an under-the-radar nominee. It was not. If it had been, I didn't know if it would be considered fantasy romance or fantasy. I thought The Hemlock Queen would be on this list. And let me double check, because I really thought it would be. The first book was, and I thought a fair amount of people read the second one, but I guess it's not on the Romantasy list. So Hemlock Queen, I was incorrect about. Now going into young adult fantasy, I had a number of predictions for this, and I think a lot of them were wrong. I don't know a lot of these. I'm not as in the know anymore about young adult fantasy. It makes me a little sad. I kind of want to remedy that, but I've been trying to read a lot of self-pub works and still get through backlist and get through series, and I definitely think the young adult fantasy has kind of fallen through the cracks a little bit when it comes to my reading of it. But anyway, Ruthless Vows, this one came out at the very end of last year, which means it is still eligible. Obviously, that's why it's here. I don't know. I think this one might win because Divine Rivals won, so I kind of think this one might win, but I don't know. Maybe something else will beat it. I was correct about The Prisoner's Throne. I thought that Heartless Hunter / The Crimson Moth would be on there. I can't remember if I mentioned that one, but I've not read this one. I've just seen a lot of people pick it up. It is on my list, even if I didn't mention it in the video. And then Air by Saba Tahir, because it's Saba Tahir, so I was pretty sure that was going to show up. Then I thought Darkstar Birding Ash Falls White would end up on the list. It didn't, so I was incorrect about that one. I hoped that Ghostsmith by Nikki Palpretto would show up. It's not there. That really bums me out. I don't know. I consider that a snub. I think that this duology deserved some love, and it's not there. I should have predicted Defiant. I think that this one I forgot about because of where it was released. I do have a tendency to forget the ones that are released at the very end of the previous year, unless it's something like Ruthless Vows, which was the very, very, very end. But I should have predicted Defiant. I had a feeling Dragon Fruit was going to be an under-the-radar one, but because it was a Book of the Month pick, I thought this might end up actually pushing through, and I was right about that. It does not look like Can't Spell Treason Without T is on any of these. I thought maybe that would have some of the sort of book talk hype. It was previously self-published, then it was traditionally published, but it looks like I was incorrect, so I can officially say that I was wrong about 11 of the fantasy predictions, which is, it sounds sad. It sounds way worse than I was, I don't know, I was hoping for better. And then let's look at horror, just to see if What Feasts at Night is there. I'm not going to know any of the other horror stories, probably, but is What Feasts at Night? It is. Okay, I predicted that correctly. That makes me really happy. I gotta say, there is a cover with an eyeball on it, and I have an eye phobia, so thanks for subjecting me to that. Whoever made that cover, I did not enjoy that. Next up, we have, this is nobody's surprise about this prediction, but under just romance, I was pretty sure Funny Story by Emily Henry would be on the list. And I was correct. It is there. I don't even feel like I should mark it because it's such an obvious prediction, but I'll give it to myself, you know? I will say I'm a little confused as to why, and maybe some of you who are more so romance and fantasy romance readers, you can chime in here because this is not my expertise by any means. Not that any of this is, but Bride by Ali Hazelwood is in romance, and it has fantasy elements, so I'm kind of like, why isn't this in Romantasy? Is it just because Ali Hazelwood, people think that's synonymous with romance instead of other genres? I mean, I know it's still a romance story. I just would have expected that it was... I mean, okay, I'll give some clarification. If a song... What's the name of the book? Yeah, A Song to Drown Rivers. Sorry, totally spaced there for a sec. If A Song to Drown Rivers is considered fantasy as opposed to fiction or historical fiction, and it barely has any speculative elements to it, then Bride, which has a number of fantasy elements to it, not being in Romantasy is surprising to me. It has more fantasy in it, I think, than A Song to Drown Rivers, so I would have thought it would have been comfortably in Romantasy. But can we not have Ali Hazelwood and Sarah J. Maas in the same place? We can't have the girls fighting. I did think that Goddess of the River might show up under just fiction, but it looks like it did not, so that one I missed. I'm going to go ahead and consider that a miss just in general because I thought it would be somewhere, so I had a lot of room to be right, and I just wasn't in that one. So let's, I'm not going to force you to sit and listen to me tally, but I'm going to tally really quick, and then I'll tell you the amount that I did get correct overall. Tallying it all up, I had 19 predictions that proved accurate across the categories, and then I had 23 if you want to give me my 4 snub predictions for fantasy, but I'm okay just saying that I had 19 that were correct. And then as far as the ones that I was spacing on and didn't even think about them, there were 11 from the fantasy category that I did not predict that were on there. Pretty obvious ones that I should have predicted. They're just not books I'm that interested in. But then if you want to count the ones that I did predict that weren't on the list, then that number bumps up to 16. So I did ultimately have more correct than incorrect, but yeah, I'm kind of bummed. I thought I had a better grasp on what was going to be there and what wasn't going to be there. But I mean, I actually think I predicted a fair amount of the fantasy ones. It's just not always the easiest with the way in which they're kind of branching out and having fantasy pop up in different, like now that we have Romantasy, I think it makes it difficult to determine what's going to go where and then if it's even going to go anywhere at all. But whatever, who cares? These are the Goodreads Choice Award nominees. These are the ones that I got correct and the ones I got incorrect. I kind of feel that this has been something I've noticed, especially having just recently done a video where I took a look back at the last 4 years and the books that popped up in the nominees. Specifically, I was looking at the ones that got the 10 most amount of votes and then the ones I had read from that top 10. And then I was kind of just in a very casual way saying whether I thought they were overhyped, underhyped, or appropriately hyped. And I have to say, having looked back very recently at what was nominated and then now looking at the nominees from this year, I'm a little underwhelmed, I think, because some years I couldn't believe 2020 was impressive. It had Rhythm of War, Addie LaRue, and Empire of Gold. I was like, those are heavy hitters. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, I can just check my notes, I think even though these books didn't work for me, that might have been the same, yeah, it was the same year that House in the Cerulean Sea came out. As such, I personally feel like 2020 knocked it out of the park. I was really impressed by the releases that year. But then if you look at just 2021, 1 year after that, I think that year was kind of odd and tricky because obviously there was a big thing that happened in 2020 that likely did impact a lot of authors as well as people that work in publishing. So I feel like 2021 is sort of an odd year for the books that got released. I think there were a lot of things that got pushed back, but there were still some things that I liked. Like, as an example, Shadow of the Gods. That was the only time any of the books from Bloodsworn have been nominated. But I do feel like maybe that year was when I started to see a shift toward standalones and toward a lot of retellings. I know retellings have been popular for a number of years, so it's not that 2021 was the origin of the popularity rise of retellings, but I do feel like because maybe some of the bigger, more epic fantasy works had to either be pushed back or put on hold for a bit because they are very demanding on authors, and 2020 was probably very demanding on said authors. Because I'm looking at the list, and within the top 10, you have Witch's Heart, Under the Whispering Door, Ariadne, and Orchida Divina. So all of those were standalones. Well, okay, technically Under the Whispering Door is a standalone. I was just about to say House in the Cerulean Sea officially has a sequel. Those are different. They're just by the same author. So you saw a lot of standalones that became popular that year. And then the following year, we sort of had a mix. So it's like you had a return to maybe more so like sword and sorcery type of fantasy books, but then also mixed in with more of the standalones. What's interesting is I feel for a long time, fantasy readers felt like there weren't enough standalones. Then we sort of seen a rise of standalones, and now they're really starting to push into the nominees quite often. But you had something like Babel, Legends and Lattes, which technically has gotten a prequel book, but Legends and Lattes was there. The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches was there. So you had some that were more of what I described about 2021, but you also had the fact that Legends and Lattes is more sword and sorcery, so that one was kind of like a blend, which in a way it's like that captures the general tone of the nominees from 2021. You also had things like The Lost Metal, so that was a lot more leaning into a certain subgenre of fantasy and certain types of readers of fantasy. Then you had Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I think this was before there was officially a Romantasy category. I think if that came out now, I wonder if it would be placed there, but I might be incorrect about that. I think I only was looking at the fantasy nominees, so that was considered fantasy. Then last year, I think, was the first year we officially had a fantasy romance category, so then we kind of got an interesting mix again, because you had something like Bookshops and Bone Dust, Amina al-Sarafi, Fragile Threads of Power, Tress of the Emerald Sea, so you kind of had this return of a certain kind of fantasy, but then you did have things like Encyclopedia of Fairies, which is a little more accessible. You had Starling House and June Farrow. So I do feel like this year we have essentially none of the sort of, you have the King Arthur one, and that one I'm like, does that fall more into mythology retelling? Even though it's a mythology that feels more like sword and sorcery, or, how would you sort of place that one? But a lot of the nominees this year feel more like what we saw in 2021. I'd be curious if I were to really step back and kind of consider why I think it's like that, try to figure out and determine what I just don't think there's been. I think this is what it comes down to. The type of fantasy that I really enjoy, which is often high and epic fantasy, those are among some of my favorites. I don't feel like we had a ton of those released this year. And that might contribute to why a lot of this year I felt kind of just middle of the road on a lot of works, because they're not the ones that I tend to really, really love. Doesn't mean that I think the quality of fantasy has gone down or anything dramatic like that, but I just think there's a certain subgenre that's not as present in the releases this year, and that's being reflected in the nominees. But I wonder if we're going to get a return to that maybe next year, if we're going to start to see more of those. I'm not sure, but this year was kind of an odd mix of different fantasy subgenres. I think one more thing I'll add is I do feel like people got fatigued of the retellings, and so you're seeing a lot less of that, which does allow for other kinds of fantasy stories to be represented, which is good. But again, I just don't know if my kind of the fantasy I tend to gravitate toward that end up being some of my favorites. I just don't know if there have been a lot of those kinds released this year. So yeah, that's it anyway for the Goodreads Choice Award nominees. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this list. I did do my 2 Goodreads from Readers video. I have recorded that. I just haven't yet edited it. I did see that there's officially an audiobook category now, which is cool. I think somebody had brought that up, but it looks like that has been officially established as its own category, so that's kind of fun, but that video will be up soon, so if you're interested in discussion about Goodreads as a whole, then that'll be up sometime in the near future. I also might do a video where maybe I'll read some more of these and then talk about ones I think are worth the hype. Maybe I'll do an official video about snubs, we'll see. But that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.